I think it's pretty crystal clear as we move into week number one that one of these two teams that we're going to watch play things out at 9:30 Eastern might have some fundamental flaws on their team. The team that I'm talking about, to be honest with you, is those Fresno State Bulldogs, which, to quote a show that I watched quite a bit during the COVID lockdowns in their opener against Kansas, they was looking a little shaky, I'm not gonna lie to you. Opening under a brand new era, under Matt Entz, listen, I think it's fair to say that no, I don't think a lot of people were actually expecting Fresno State to win. I think that would have been a unfair expectation about this Fresno State Bulldogs squad going into week number 0. But they got crushed. Not crushed, I would say, but they lost pretty decisively in week number 0. A 31-7 loss on the road against the Kansas Jayhawks. And really, outside of that very first drive of the game, where Fresno State scored its only points of the entire game, they could not get the run game going at all. They went for just 37 yards on the ground. They had to put the ball in the hands of E.J. Warner probably a little bit more often than what they would have been a little bit more comfortable with doing, because although EJ Warner does come in with multiple years of starting experience dating back to when he first started out as the starting quarterback for the Temple Owls a few years ago, and then he was the starting quarterback for Rice. Definitely don't want to play with food by any means, and now he's at least initially, the starting quarterback for Fresno State. He was always a turnover prone guy. Just kind of imagine Jameis Winston and his ability to take care of the football without maybe as much upside as maybe what a Jameis Winston would necessarily bring to the table. And it showed when he had to put the ball in his hands a lot more. And granted, he did make some plays in the Kansas game. He made some he hung tough in the pocket. He did make some good throws, and not even all of the turnovers that EJ Warner had were his fault. There was an interception, particularly in the second half, where he went and he threw it to the receiver. It was in the receiver's hands. He couldn't bring it in. It bounces upward, leads to a Kansas interception. So he had 3 turnovers, but not all of the turnovers were his fault. But a prevalent issue for the Fresno State Bulldogs that we saw in week number 0 was that Kansas was able to control the trenches on both sides of the ball, and it just made for a really long evening for Fresno State fans. And now we go ahead and get into really a somewhat pivotal matchup that can really set the tone for the rest of the season, as now Fresno State, they get to come back home. They're in their home building, and you're taking on the Georgia Southern Eagles, who come in and they have some high expectations in the Sun Belt this year. Georgia Southern, they do come in under 4th-year head coach Clay Helton, coming off of a season where, they did finish somewhat in the upper echelons of the Sun Belt last year, but they're looking to have higher expectations, where they're looking to try to finish, be in that conversation for an East Division title, as they were picked to finish 2nd in the Sun Belt East coaches poll. And they do also come back with some all Sun Belt honorees, multiple guys, including Caleb Cook, Josh Dallas, the wide receiver, defensive lineman Latrell Board, and not to mention Chance Gamble, the DB, Alex Smith, the punter, and Brandon Harrigan, who transfers in from Appalachian State. So transferring from one rival to another. So definitely coming back with some experience on both sides of the ball, as they do come with those preseason all-conference nominees. And so you hear this matchup that's happening for really the very first time ever. We have never seen Georgia Southern play Fresno State either in the regular season or play in some kind of bowl game, even though Georgia Southern recently made the transition up to the FBS ranks in the 2010s. Fresno State obviously been around in that FBS level of football for significantly longer than that. So you hear all those things that I mentioned with Georgia Southern having all of that talent among the all Sun Belt honorees, multiple guys, and coming from a really good conference in the Sun Belt. I like to personally call it the Fun Belt. And then you also hear about all the issues that Fresno State had in week number 0. So you would think that I would just go ahead and it could be possible splattering territory. That could be the case, right? Well, I thought about it quite a bit, and while I was originally going to lean one way, but I ended up changing my mind. And the reason why I changed my mind is for one fundamental reason. So the fundamental reason that I thought about earlier today as I was driving home from work is that, yes, Fresno State did not look good. But I also think this is a case where we do see a little bit of an overreaction in the betting markets. And something that I always try to do is I always try to react like honey and not like water, especially in the early parts of the season. And so even though Fresno State looked extremely rough, you have to realize it's week 0, okay? So we know that because of the fact that it is week 0, we know that teams are typically not going to look sharp in week 0. And that was certainly the case for Fresno State with multiple turnovers and not really being able to move the ball with any kind of consistency. Although if EJ Warner can get some protection, maybe he could sneak out a breakout season. Who knows? But one advantage that Fresno State does have is the fact that they got their opening game out of the way. And they got their opening game against, in my opinion, at least on paper, a superior talented roster than what they're going to go up against in Georgia Southern. And what you're also going to see as well is that this Georgia Southern team is going to have to fly all the way across the country in order to play Fresno State. So you got Georgia Southern making a dramatic adjustment to the time zones, going from Eastern Standard Time to Western Standard Time. And I talked about this in other previews, I think earlier this week. But the more I sit down and think about it, historically speaking, when you see teams make that transition going from the West Coast to the East Coast or the East Coast to the West Coast, the team that's making that type of travel typically does not play well. I think about when Illinois went on the road to play against Oregon last year, or vice versa, when Oregon went on the road and took on Wisconsin. Wisconsin, a team that did not make a bowl game last year. And yet, in spite of that, Wisconsin gave Oregon everything that they can handle, and they nearly pulled off this upset. Now, I do think that there's some things that do need to happen in order for Fresno State to come out here and pull this off. First and foremost, obviously, you have to be able to run the ball so much better than that, right? You cannot run for less than 50 yards in a game. That's simply not sustainable. That creates a complete lack of balance. And so, in order to be competitive against Georgia Southern, you're looking at, you got to get at least 100 yards. I think ideally, you got to get 150 plus rushing yards, as well as maybe some explosive runs to take pressure off of EJ Warner, who's a solid starting quarterback. He has experience, and I think we saw some of those really good throws in the game against Kansas. But the game also cannot be placed on EJ Warner at the same time, which leads me to my second point. They have to take much better care of the football. Now, not all of the turnovers are obviously EJ Warner's fault, but they did have 3 turnovers in the game. And they also failed to really get any turnovers themselves. So because of that, you also really need to take much better care of the ball, or at least be even in the turnover margin. Close to even, maybe -1 at worst. That's gonna help in terms of really ensuring that you're not creating too many extra possessions for what we've seen as a somewhat explosive offense for Georgia Southern. I think that's extremely important as well. You also got to lean on that defense and the veteran depth that's over there at Fresno State. They actually have a pretty solid secondary out there in Fresno. You got Alzillian Hamilton leading the way, for example, who's a four award candidate. But then you also need guys like Jaden Pearson at linebacker and talented edge pieces like Finn Claypool to step up and make some plays. And so if that front holds firm and that defense gets some help from the offensive side of the ball and able to find more of that offensive balance and maybe force Georgia Southern into some third and long situations and create that imbalance for them on the other side, you could create some either defensive scoring opportunities or some short fields for your offense to help yourself out. So, with all of that in mind, because Georgia Southern is actually playing their first game, while Fresno State, they got their first game out of the way, I actually expect Fresno State to play a little bit of a cleaner game. And just to kind of dive into what I'm thinking and what my line of thinking is right now, we'll take a look at the model real quick. The model right now is showing a different story than what we have going on FanDuel right now. Just checking FanDuel right before recording this preview. Georgia Southern is currently favored, and it's a short favorite. 1.5 point favorite on the road. However, with that being said, Fresno State, according to our internal metrics and turning to our internal power rating model, the model still thinks that the wrong team is favored. The model believes that Fresno State actually should be favored by that same margin, by that 1.5 point margin. And so, combining the fact that not only you're going to have your traditional home field advantage, but the team that you're going up against is making a cross-country road trip in order to play you in the first place. Not to mention you got your first game out of the way, so should be able to polish things up. You know what you need to work on, and should expect to see a cleaner game from Fresno State overall. While Georgia Southern, we don't know whether what the true weaknesses of this team is. We know what the question marks are. We talked about it in our Sun Belt preview before the season even started. But we don't know if they're weaknesses or if they're actually strengths of this team. We don't know, and we saw this perfectly happen in the Kansas State-Iowa State game, where it's a sloppy game, and we saw sloppy games around the country. Think UNLV in their matchup against Idaho State 2, or Stanford playing against Hawaii. We've seen this around the country. I think Georgia Southern might get off to a slower start, and even though a lot of people are down the Bulldogs right now, and rightfully so, again, they did not play good against Kansas. I don't think necessarily that they should be counted out, and matter of fact, I am going to side with my brothers and sisters from Fresno, California, and I actually think Fresno State's going to be able to pull this off. I think they get the win here against Georgia Southern in what we call a CFP elimination matchup. And so we're going to go with Fresno State not only covering, but also winning outright as well. And so we'll have Fresno State winning 27-24, being your final score, and Fresno State being able to get their very first win of the season, bouncing back after what was a demoralizing loss to the Kansas Jayhawks. I think they pulled together here a little bit.